Hi, my name is Disha Aluwalia. I'm an archaeologist and I write columns on archaeology for The Print. I'm a researcher and I also curate an Instagram page called Confessions of an Archaeologist where I bring archaeological facts and bust myths in public domain. So today on Answered, I'll be busting some myths about archaeology and answering some questions. How do archaeologists know where to dig? Can you just dig anywhere? Well, we can't dig anywhere. I mean, it's expensive to dig anywhere. But how do we know where to dig? Actually, there's a lot of work that we need to do before we go to a site or we start digging. The first step is actually to look at the research material, everything that has been studied, in a particular region, a district or tehsil, or even a small village. So we go through the gazetteers, the literature review part and everything, and then we collect material from the surface. So randomly select some maybe broken potsherds. If we find antiquity, if we're lucky to find antiquity, that'll really help us. They are good indicators as to what we're going to find beneath the ground. And then once we have studied the surface material, the material from exploration, that's when we actually decide to dig. So digging is a long process. It takes time, it's tedious, and it's also expensive because we can't dig alone. We need to hire people to dig, and that costs. We just don't dig wherever we go. We do a lot of work, and that at times, for one dig, we have to work for a year before we actually start digging. So it's a long process. You mentioned many 3658 asks, why is such a scarcity of historical and archaeological from Patna? So I think what the question means is why there's scarcity of historical and archaeological remains from Patna. Actually, this is a myth. This is a wrong information. Actually, there's a lot of historical references and remains at Patna. And Patna, in fact, archaeologically was very rich. But unfortunately, today, because of urbanizations, a lot of new buildings come up, and the old remains have sort of being destroyed rapidly, and today you don't find anything. In fact, interestingly, there's this place called Panchpahadi, which meant that there were 5 stupas at that particular place. Today there's a colony which has a postal address with this particular name but no stupas. A Chinese traveler's record actually tell us a lot about what ancient Patna or Patliputra used to look like. It was a wooden palisade with multiple gates, and in fact there were multiple stupas built by different people, traders, not just the rulers, but in the memory of Buddha and Gautam Buddha, and also there were a lot of temples as well. So they were not just Buddhists living in the city, but others who follow Shaivism or other form of religion would live there. And historical records tell us that Patna was actually a very important place in terms of trade of 3rd century BCE. Historically, we do find a lot. Archaeologically, we can't dig because there's no space to dig in the modern city of Patna, which was ancient Patliputra, and therefore, unfortunately, archaeologically, we can't say much, but historically, we can certainly say a lot. What would you do if someone came to you and said they found a coin hoard in their backyard? What if they were human bones? Would you call the police first? No, I have not called the police first. For coin hoard, we will go through the coin hoard, try and see whether they are preserved, and try and understand which dynasty or which period those coins belong to, and perhaps call the ASI office or get them registered, but not call the police. For human bones, perhaps call an archaeologist if you think the bones are really, really old. Or if they're not old, then call the police. What does a typical day of an archaeologist look like? Is it dangerous? Dangerous? I think my entire experience is colored by Indiana Jones. Yes. Unfortunately, it's not dangerous. It's only dangerous if you find a snake under your bed in your tent, or you find a monitor lizard. Monitor lizards are not poisonous, they don't do anything, but they are big and they look very scary. It's only dangerous when you fall in a trench or you sort of get hurt, but otherwise we are not chased by ghosts, or we don't stumble upon cursed relics or anything like that. We dig garbage which actually people have left behind. So imagine you shifting to another house, and imagine the things that you're going to leave behind. They're going to be pure garbage for you because you're going to take all the good things with you, right? So we are digging garbage. We are not digging anything Indiana Jones like. The work of an archaeologist is not dangerous in that sense. A typical day feels, it's like waking up in the morning, starting with a cup of tea because that's really important. It fuels, or if you're a coffee drinker, then have a cup of coffee, have your breakfast, go to the site, start digging, and then break for lunch, and then again go to the site, start digging. And once you come back in the evening, whatever you have done throughout the day, you record, you get all the antiquities you have to detail, put details in the register, record antiquities, pack them and keep them in a safe place, and then perhaps sleep around 12 o'clock at night. So a day of an archaeologist is quite a long day because we have a very short period of time and less fun, so we have to really make up for that. But it's not Indiana Jones like. I wish it was, but it's not. Archaeologists, is there a way AI can help you in your work? A lot of people have asked me this question honestly, especially with a lot of interest in AI recently. I don't think so. AI can never replace what we do because our work is very physical in nature. AI perhaps can help us in conjecture. If you have to imagine how the Indus city would look like or how Patliputra would used to look like, perhaps then we may take help of AI. But AI is of no help to us if we are the ones who are going to dig so all the time. So I don't think AI is ever going to help us till we find a technology is going to replace us in the field, with the digs and everything. How close are we to decipher the IVC script? What are the gaps in our knowledge that needs to be filled? I don't think we're close enough. We're just looking at different things and nothing is adding up. Some people just come up and say they have deciphered, and they say they claim that they're deciphered, and they give you a theory, mathematical and whatever. But I don't think anything adds up because we still need to work a lot, and we need to work with linguists, we need to work with archaeologists, and we need to come together on one platform and work because things don't work in isolation, especially when you are dealing with a culture which is about 6,000 years old. I don't think we are close enough, but I'm hoping that sooner or later we'll have a breakthrough in research and we'll perhaps come closer to understand the meaning of the script, in near future. The gaps in our knowledge is again, you have a propaganda, you have a theory which is extreme, and then there is nothing. There is no application in field. So if somebody comes and says that I have deciphered this script and the script says this, an archaeologist need to then sit and see whether it makes sense or not. There has to be some collaboration. So there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and it's also because we don't have a Rosetta Stone. If we find a Rosetta Stone, if we find a missing link, perhaps then we'll be closer to finding a proper, to understand the script better and understand the Indus or Harappan civilization better. And the next question is on the use of gold and how gold played an important role in the Indian narrative. So gold, very interestingly, we don't find a lot of gold in archaeological context, and the reason is very simple. You're not going to leave your gold objects lying around when you're moving, right? You're going to take that gold because gold you can melt and then you can reuse it. Now, how did the use of gold really started in the Indian society? It goes back to sort of the earliest evidence we find of usage of gold is in the Neolithic period in Mehergarh, and then we have gold in Indus or Harappan civilization. There are many theories as to where the gold was coming from. Now, Kolar mines have always been one of the most important sources of gold in India. Still today is one of the most important sources of gold. But there are also some scholars who believe that the Indus or Harappans were using alluvial gold, which is in the river sand you find the gold dust. They would collect the gold dust, melt it, and make ornaments out of it. But gold was used sporadically, especially by people who can afford. Gold has always been that symbol of wealth which has still remained in our society, and it has this ability to sort of mold. You can melt it and make something else if we don't want. And a lot of our mothers do that, right? If I don't like a design, if I don't like her old design, she will just take it to a jeweler, make a new jewelry out of it, and then hand over as a heirloom. So that is something which has always remained part of the subcontinent's cultural milieu and has not changed, which is fascinating. And this is the reason why we find only broken sort of flakes, at times, even tiniest speck of gold in archaeological remain, which we have to really carefully sieve from the sediment that we are digging. So we rarely find a hoard. Hoards are usually found out of context, or even if we have to find like a bangle or something, we would find in burial, which was a bangle or maybe a necklace buried with the disease. In that case, we find gold, but usually gold is then taken forward with the next generation. It's part of the generational wealth. It's what we today understand as part of our investment. Must have been a thought even in ancient times, and that thought has never changed at all. How did ancient societies discover how to use metal? Did someone just collect some shiny rock or something and decide to burn it? No, that didn't happen. See, you need to understand that our species is very intelligent. I mean, you who's listening is intelligent, right? The Homo sapiens are very, very intelligent hominid species. So, of course, they didn't collect just shiny rock and burn it. Early humans knew how to use tools. They knew how to survive. They manufactured tools which are even better than present day knife or blade, and with such precision, they created tools from rocks which were locally available. So you can understand that they were quite intelligent enough to not just find shiny rocks. And secondly, the ores that you find are not shiny at all. There are a lot of impurities. So any metal that you find, be it copper, iron ore, they're not shiny. They have to undergo a process of smelting at a particular temperature, and then the impurities are removed, which are in form of slag, and then that pure metal is given shape of any tool. So it's not very easy. How did they come about to use metal? It perhaps could have been accidental, the use of the first metal, because you need to understand that humans were exploring their environment. They were exploring and exploiting the resources available to them near to where they are living. So, for instance, if we have to talk about copper, people living in Rajasthan, especially around Khetri, they are using stone tools. But perhaps while they are looking for resources, must have stumbled upon copper, and that must have ignited the curiosity which led them to create a copper tool. So it could have been accidental, but we don't find that in archaeological remain. What we find is that society was quite well aware of metallurgy. They knew about at what temperature what metal needs to be smelted. They knew that if they add tin to copper, it'll become bronze, and they knew about the properties, and that must have taken some time, must have been a period of trial and error, and that happens even with us. I don't think it would have been that easy, but unfortunately we don't know exactly what went on when around proto-historic period, about 7,000 to 6,000 BCE, which would be around 8,000 years ago. Humans started to use copper as the first metal. So copper was the first metal which was used not just in Indian subcontinent but across the globe. And then comes iron. So we don't really know as to how that happened, but must have been a slow process. But you need to also understand our ancient society were way more intelligent and they were way advanced, and we are here because of them. How did humans develop agriculture? Did tools come first or the farming? What about the seeds? So it's an interesting question. Agriculture, basically the advent of agriculture goes hand in hand with what humans decide to do. They decided that they are now no longer going to wander off and forage. They are now going to move from one place to the other. They are going to be staying in one place. So when you stay in one place, you need to find food or you need to support your family, because there must have been a clan moving together, right? So in order to do so, you first will start foraging, start finding wild grains in the forest, or fruits, or anything which is edible. And then from there, the curiosity of maybe, we can grow this. We as humans are very curious. We take one thing, and the next thing is to sort of try and make it our own, or try and create it, or try and build it. So we do that. Our entire society, the way we are progressing, is an example of that, right? The early humans must have found these grains in the wild. So we do have wild rice, we do have other wild legumes, and then they were domesticated. So agriculture go hand in hand with domestication. The moment humans decided they're going to stay in one place, they're not going to move from one place to the other, that's when the need for agriculture started. And another part of the question is, with whether the tools came first, or the farming. Actually, the tools were first, the farming came later. The tools were sort of modified to use for farming. Even the animal domestication comes with the domestication of plant. Using cattle in the field for the for cultivation and other purposes came with staying in one place. So sedentary life is actually the reason why all of this, the whole thing happened. What we do today is because somewhere about 10,000, 8,000, 9,000 years ago, humans decided that they're not going to hunt. They're not going to move from one place to the other. They're going to stay. They're going to have big families. They're going to have, a society. They're going to have about 10, 12 families living together in a group. And that's it. And today here we are living a very sedentary life. And we are actually very lucky. The next question is, I think my nephew is going to become an archaeologist. He keeps playing in the mud and digs all the time. How do you study archaeology if you are in India? If your nephew wants to become an archaeologist, well, great. So playing in the mud is one of the key things, requirements for an archaeologist. And I think your nephew fits the bill. How do we become an archaeologist, or you can study to be an archaeology in India? The path is very simple, but you can take a detour. The simple path is that you do your bachelor's in history and archaeology, and then you do your master's, and then you do your PhD. And between master's and PhD, you go and work in whichever period or area that you want to work. The detour is that you study some sciences, maybe botany, zoology, chemistry, or anything, and then you venture into archaeology. Archaeology is not just about digging, right? We need a lot of scientific application as well. So there is a detour as well in studying archaeology. So in India, I followed a very traditional path. I did my bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and in between I worked at different sites with different people. So you can do that, and perhaps by the time your nephew grows up, there'll be many, many more ways of becoming an archaeologist. Maybe you can ask me this question 10 years down the line. The next question is, how can communities who live in the vicinity of a historical monument come together to play a role in conservation? It's a very, very important question. I think it's a need of the hour. We, the people, not the archaeologists, but you all, if you live in a place which is very close to a monument or an archaeological mound, can really protect it. Don't wait for the government or agency to come and protect it. You can do it. You play a key role in protecting, conserving, and preserving an archaeological monument or a site or build heritage or anything. All you have to do is take ownership. You have to consider that monument as part of your community, as part of your heritage, and try and preserve it, keep it clean. I think keeping our monuments clean is the first step and a very important step. We throw trash around a monument, especially if they are not protected. We draw graffitis on a monument, even if they are protected, even if it's on the ceiling. I've seen monuments which are protected and graffiti on the ceiling. I don't know how that's done, but people do that. So the key thing is to take ownership. Remember that it's a community heritage. It does not belong to ASI. It does not belong to a government body. It does not belong to a small group of archaeologists or heritage conservationists. It belongs to you. It belongs to us, and it's going to be part of our future generations' existence as well. So we play a very important role in doing so, in protecting. So protect your monuments, take care of them, don't wait for the government to do so. There's a trend I've seen that if we have to build a new building, the old monuments sort of are leveled. Try and not do that, try and protect and fight against that. I understand that we need space because we are a growing economy, but we also need to protect a portion of the past, right? What are the tools that an archaeologist use? They seems to have a lot more brushes than I thought they would. The brushes are a very important part of a toolkit. They are the heroes, let me tell you. I use more brushes than I use, instead of a trowel, because the brush really exposes mud structures well. It cleans the dirt, and it's a slow, because archaeology is slow process, so it sort of is very non-invasive in a sense. So brushes, of course, we use a lot of brushes, different sizes of brushes, different types of brushes. Apart from that, we use trowels, we use knives, we use a different scrapers. So we usually make our own tools, a different site if we require different tools. So at site like Sonali, we had excavator, it was a burial site. We used dental tools because it was so integrated, the carvings and everything. We even got our own tools made especially for the purpose. So we use variety of tools, but brushes are the hero. If you ask my students whom I have trained, they'll tell you that I love brushes. What, according to an archaeologist, is the most important tool that a pre-modern human would have used? Hand axe. Hand axe is where it all began. The hand axe used to be very big. You know, the pre-Homo sapien, the Homo habilis was the first hominin species which actually started to make tools, and the hand axes used to be this big, heavy hand axes, but that was very important tool, I think. And to make that tool, you have to use a lot of techniques, especially in flaking out stones. So you take a big stone and you create an outline which would be sort of like this, like pointed at one end and sort of round near the butt. And then you flake it off to make a very sharp edge. That helps you to cut meat, butchering, and also for other purposes. So hand axe was one of those important tools which actually must have started the stone tool revolution, because as we moved forward in time, the hand axes started to become smaller and much more sharper and efficient. Something similar to our phones or any other device we use. So according to me, it's in a hand axe. Well, that was fun answering all of the questions here at Answered. If you want to know more about archaeology, you can follow me on Instagram or on X. Just follow Disha Ahluwalia or Confessions of an Archaeologist. Or you can also follow my video essays or my columns at The Print. I publish them every fortnight, and do follow. Maybe you will find your answer there as well. And thank you once again for listening.